Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 56, the second episode in this series, Exploring the Kingdom Plantae. Last episode, I dived right into the wild lakes and ponds with their slimy algae crusts to explore the green algae ancestors of all plant life. Today, I'll be moving down the evolutionary lineage and exploring the organisms of the next major divergence. These are some of the first simple land plants that evolved from the algae. These are the Bryophytes, the Liverworts, Hornworts, and the mosses that cover so much of our planet. Collectively, these Bryophytes include about 20,000 species, all of them small, non-vascular plants that compose the soft, herbaceous carpeting of the forest floor. The first ancestral Bryophytes emerged from the algae mats sometime around 510 to 630 million years ago. Because the rest of the land plants would diverge from this Bryophyte lineage, the Bryophytes are kind of like an intermediate grouping between the almost entirely aquatic green algae and the almost entirely terrestrial vascular land plants. The Bryophytes share many qualities from both of these groups, which is why the Bryophytes can live in both semi-aquatic and terrestrial environments. The green algae share traits with the Bryophytes, like having similar chloroplast structures and identical chlorophyll pigments. Although pretty much all plants have these same chlorophyll pigments, so I guess that this is more an example of a trait in the founding population that persisted in virtually all of its descendants, more than it is just a trait shared between green algae and Bryophytes. On that note, more specific to green algae and Bryophytes, the Bryophytes depend on water for the transport of their sperm. They depend on water for their reproduction. This critical trait really confirms their close relationship with green algae, which also require water to reproduce. Green algae require water for a whole lot more, too, but that's because they're semi-aquatic. And in today's episode, we're going down the evolutionary chain to talk about the more terrestrial Bryophytes. They spend more time on dry land than they do in the water, so necessarily, they're a little less dependent on the water. Some of the emergent traits that make them able to tolerate life on dry land include a cuticle, or a thin layer of a waxy secretion that helps to protect the outer layer of the plant from desiccating, from drying out in the sun and the dry air. The Bryophytes have also evolved to consolidate their cellular structure. Where algae are often just slimy clumps of filaments and single cells, or ribbon-like growths of unvascularized tissue like kelp and seaweed, the Bryophytes have consolidated the important cells into distinct structures, like the gametangia organs that protect the gametes, now that they're being held up in the open air and aren't being dispersed around in the water. To put this another way, the Bryophytes have evolved to have more specialized tissues, and this evolutionary trend of increasingly specialized tissues will continue throughout the kingdom Plantae. Now, one of the most defining and important evolutionary adaptations that emerged in the Bryophytes was a stage of embryonic development. This is a period between conception and true waking life, where the young plant is developing on a chemical level. Where multicellular algae often grows in simple shapes with relatively low cellular differentiation, Bryophytes and the rest of the land plants are built with very differentiated tissues. And to organize all of this differentiation, the beginning of the plant's life has to go through a period of embryogenesis. The zygote has to grow and develop internally before it can germinate, and during this process, the cells are differentiating and getting organized so that they can grow into a healthy, properly arranged, properly functioning, mature organism. Algae doesn't do this. Algae doesn't really need to do this, but the evolutionary emergence of this embryonic stage in early development laid the genetic and morphological groundwork for future plant evolution. It literally created a stage within the plant's life cycle wherein it could heavily focus almost entirely on tissue specialization, cellular differentiation, and establishing a more complex body form. All of this genetic and morphological and developmental architecture that's emerging in the bryophyte lineage is literally the material that subsequent plant generations would build off of to diverge into the ferns and the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Although I really shouldn't make it seem like the early evolution of the bryophytes is set in stone. There's actually quite a lot of discussion over this issue, because genetic and proteomic studies keep yielding inconsistent results. Some posit that the bryophytes and the ancestor of the rest of the vascular land plants evolved independently, and that the bryophytes are actually a monophyletic sister clade to the monophyletic vascular plants clade. So in one sense, they didn't emerge one from the other, they diverged from each other and were sister clades ever since. Additionally, there are some studies that suggest that hornworts might not even be bryophytes, that they might instead be more closely related to some kinds of vascular plants, and that the bryophytes are really just the mosses and liverworts. The more popular opinion, or the general consensus that seems to exist among most plant scientists, is that the bryophytes are a paraphyletic group. This position argues that the liverworts were the first bryophytes to appear, from which diverged mosses, from which diverged hornworts, from which diverged the rest of the vascular plants. In this way, the bryophytes aren't monophyletic, because they don't include the vascular land plants, which share a common ancestor with all of the other bryophytes. Alright, so let's take a deeper look at the bryophytes, starting with the OG bryophyte, the liverworts. The visible macroscopic structures that make up the liverwort's body are composed of haploid cells from the gametophyte generation. Remember, these are plants, so they all have the alternation of generations. They have the haploid gametophyte form and the diploid sporophyte form. I've explained this phenomenon in multiple episodes, so today, and most likely for episodes going on into the future, I'm not going to bother setting aside some time to explain it in great detail. I'm just going to assume that you have a general familiarity with it, and we're going to go from there. Alright, so moving on. The liverworts are typically less than 10 centimeters tall, and anywhere from 2 to 20 millimeters wide, so they have dimensions that can be measured in single-digit inches, often being smaller or narrower than your thumb. Many species of liverwort have a growth form called a thallus, which is a multicellular organism whose tissues are not organized into organs, and they show little to no differentiation of specific structures. In a thallus of sargassum weeds, for example, the plant just grows and branches into a messy, tangled pile. If you're looking at any of the individual strands, you can't really tell where the midpoint is. You can't really tell where up and down is. The branching structures are just too wild and disorganized, and there's no differentiated tissue, so it's hard to orient the organism's body in any particular way. This thallus is just a mess of continuously growing vegetative tissue. Now, in liverworts, their thallus looks like a flat, slimy green sheet, with overlapping folds growing in an asymmetric organic shape. Other liverworts have a more traditional plant-like shape, with a central stalk or stem structure dotted by pairs of leaves, with a clump or node of specialized leaves at the top. Although, because these plants are not vascularized, there are no true veins running through their leaves or through their stems, so when you hold a liverwort in your hand and look at it, it looks almost rubbery or like molded plastic. It doesn't have any of the vascular tissue, the veins, that you would typically identify as part of a complex living macroscopic organism. With regards to the rest of the plant kingdom, the liverworts are strange outcasts. After other bryophyte lineages had diverged from them, the liverworts experienced significant divergence in their own right, being the only extant land plants in the world whose sporophyte generation doesn't possess stomata. This is primarily because the sporophyte generation of the liverwort's reproductive cycle is tiny, almost microscopic, and very short-lived. When haploid sperm flows with the help of water into the archegonium to fertilize a haploid egg, this newly formed diploid embryo is retained on the archegonia. It's retained on the female gametophyte. The diploid sporophyte embryo will grow into a mass of cells with rudimentary parts. A foot region will emerge to anchor the rest of the embryo to the surface of the archegonium, and this foot, this anchor, serves as a corridor for nutrient transport between the mother plant and the offspring. And then you have a seta, which is like a thick connective fiber linking the foot to the rest of the embryo. And then there's the capsule, which is basically the rest of the embryo. The capsule is like a globular balloon that's filled by all of the new spores being formed. When the seta grows, it extends and pushes the capsule up and out of the archegonium. Exposed to the dry air, this capsule can rupture, releasing the spores into the wind or the water to be carried by whatever medium to a place where they can land and germinate with their little rhizoids and become new gametophyte individuals. The germinated spore grows into a mass of filaments, which condenses into a globular sheet or a chunk of biomass, which is going to be the bulk of the liverwort's mature body. From this mature body of the gametophyte, the sex structures are lifted upwards on the ends of protruding stalks of tissue. In males, this structure is called the antheridia, which produces sperm cells. In females, the structure is the archegonia, and it produces and holds the eggs. In episode 53 on plant reproduction, I briefly talked about the monoecious and dioecious plants. Well, liverworts can be monoecious and dioecious too. Those liverworts that are monoecious have both male and female sex organs, just equipped on their own individual branches, while those liverworts that are dioecious have just one type of sex organ or the other on all of their branches. In any case, the sperm of the liverworts have two flagella that they use to swim through the water, to get from their antheridium to the archegonia to fertilize the egg. Because some species of liverwort produce both male and female sex organs, it's entirely possible for them to self-fertilize themselves, or to reproduce asexually. But they can also reproduce asexually in another fashion, which typically involves the use of structures called gemma cups, which are shallow, bowl, or cup-like depressions in the plant's tissue. Inside of these gemma cups are disc-like wads of haploid tissue called gemmi. When it's raining and a raindrop falls into the gemma cup, the force of the raindrop can splash and blast the gemmi outwards, where they presumably land somewhere and then germinate into a new clonal individual. Because this form of reproduction doesn't involve the genetic material of another individual, it's an asexual process. And on a very fundamental level, it's not even remotely sexual because it doesn't involve any types of gametes interacting and fusing, even if it's their own gametes, which is the case with some of these dioecious liverworts with both male and female sex organs. This kind of reproduction with these gemma cups is called fragmentation, because the parent individual is literally being fragmented or broken apart, and these fragments can survive and establish themselves and become new clonal individuals. These liverworts are most closely related to mosses, of whom they share many traits with, like a dominant haploid gametophyte generation, a lack of vasculature, the use of spores to reproduce, and many, many other similarities. But there are some differences. All of the bryophytes, be they liverworts, mosses, or hornworts, they all possess structures called rhizoids, instead of roots. The rhizoids are thin, filamentous structures that help to anchor the bryophyte to its substrate, to the ground, to whatever it is they're growing on. These rhizoids help to keep it upright and keep it in place. Unlike roots, rhizoid tissue isn't absorptive. It does not extract water or nutrients from the soil, or whatever substrate it's growing on, be it rocks, or tree bark, or acidic boreal soil. In the liverworts and the hornworts, each rhizoid is a single, huge, overly extended cell. But in mosses, the rhizoids are larger and thicker because they're multicellular. Where liverworts can grow in a thalloid structure with a tangled mass of undifferentiated tissue, or in a foliose structure with an identifiable stem and leaf structure, the various moss species only grow in a foliose structure. They only grow a body form with a stem and leaves. The gametophyte generation of moss has a relatively simple morphology, including a tiny thin stem with small, thin little leaves coming off of it. The fuzzy aesthetic of moss becomes evident when you look at a big patch of moss, when you look at thousands of little stems, all covered in leaves that are so small they might as well be hairs. The stems begin as buds that grow out of nodes in the rhizoid tissue. Because the rhizoid tissue runs horizontally under the surface of the soil, it can connect multiple shoots. This means that if you look at a patch of moss and you see, for example, a dozen little shoots poking up, a dozen little fuzzy stalks of moss, this isn't necessarily 12 moss individuals. It's entirely possible, it's quite likely actually, that this little patch of moss you're looking at is just a single individual, with a dozen gametophyte shoots poking up to throw their spores into the air. Moss has reproductive mechanisms that are pretty similar to liverworts. For example, the moss can grow gemmi that can fragment off and generate a new individual. This new individual is a clone of the parent, as they were produced through this asexual fragmentation process. The alternation of generations begins when a spore germinates and produces a mass of filaments or some kind of thallus, and from this intermediate structure, the shoots of the gametophyte erupt upwards. A single spore can end up creating multiple little gametophore shoots. The gametophores are thin stems, just a few millimeters tall, with numerous small little hair-like leaves. At their tip are the sex organs of the moss. The female archegonia is nestled within the parachaeta, which are the specialized leaves at the top of the gametophore that wrap around and protect the female sex organ. Just like the liverworts, the archegonia hold the eggs, and they have a column or a tube-like structure that sperm has to travel down to fertilize the eggs. Now, the male sex organs are the antheridia, and these are also surrounded by a protective layer of specialized leaves called the perigonia. Again, like liverworts, the mosses have monoecious and dioecious species as well. Species of monoecious moss can reproduce asexually simply by floating some of their sperm a short distance to some of their eggs. Some of these moss species can keep their antheridia, and thus their sperm, inside of little cup-shaped structures, so that when a raindrop lands in the cup, it'll splash sperm out multiple centimeters in any direction. And this can help to fertilize itself in asexual reproduction, or to fertilize other individuals. And this takes me to sexual reproduction, which works pretty much the same way. It simply requires water as a matrix for the sperm to travel in, so that the sperm can flow into the archegonia and fertilize the egg. This creates a diploid sporophyte zygote, which will grow into the mature sporophyte. In moss, this mature sporophyte typically looks like a tall, thin stalk protruding from the shorter, wigglier, fuzzier moss gametophyte. So if you thought the gametophyte was a tiny, thin little stalk, the sporophyte that grows on top of it is even smaller and even thinner. At the top of this long sporophyte stalk is another capsule, which is equipped with a little cap called an operculum. This sporophyte capsule is filled with spores, and when the sporophyte matures, ages, and eventually dries out, the capsule will degrade, the operculum will fall off or be destroyed, and all of the spores will be released into the wind. In many species of moss, this degradation process creates an explosive release of the spores, spraying them some distance from the parent. In sphagnum mosses, for example, the shrinking capsule creates an increasing internal pressure, and at a certain threshold where the pressure is too great, it'll blast the capsule open, launching all of the spores with it. Like the liverworts, the moss will also sometimes grow gemmacups, or other similar structures that take advantage of the force of a splashing raindrop to propel their spores, or their sperm. Remember that the moss are bryophytes, and they require at least some water, at least a thin layer of water for their sperm to swim through. The bryophyte sperm is equipped with two flagella that it uses to propel itself through this watery matrix to another individual, and to get to the female archegonia structures and swim down the neck canal to the egg. One of the largest clades of moss is the Sphagnum genus. The sphagnum mosses exist all over the planet, especially in the northern hemisphere, where they exist on the bark of the trees in the boreal forests, and on the forest floor, and all across the vast expanses of tundra that characterize much of northern Canada, Alaska, Siberia, and Scandinavia. These mosses also exist in the southern hemisphere, like in Argentina and Chile, New Zealand, and Tasmania. Where sphagnum moss grows, it tends to create peat moss, or peat bogs. This is an interesting process that starts with the quality of the moss's cells, and so to explain this, I'll work backward from peat bog to the moss's cell. Alright, so the organic material called peat, or turf, is a kind of soil composed of plant biomass at various stages of decomposition. It's generated as plants grow and die and grow and die and so on and so forth, creating a rising carpet of vegetable matter building off of the decaying bodies of its forebears. When the plants decay, they give off CO2, and they release nitrogenous compounds, and the living plants growing on top of this decaying mass will directly absorb these nutrients to fuel their own growth. In this way, the ecological relationship between the living plants on the surface of the peat and the decaying plants in the dead peat itself is almost self-sustaining. Obviously, some carbon has to be brought into the system in the first place to get it all going, but there is a fair degree of carbon recycling in the upper layer of the peat. The majority of these decaying plants within the peat are sphagnum moss, which curls up when it dies and gets pressed below the young, living moss, which is actively growing and reaching upward to get at the sunlight. This living upper surface layer of the moss kind of stomps down the dead and decaying moss below it, and over long periods of time, this builds up into compressed peat soil that can be meters and meters deep. All of this peat is very absorptive of water. It's extremely absorptive of water. So when it rains, or when a river floods, the peat just sucks up a ton of the water and holds it, making the peat very muddy. This accumulation of water in the soil can make the peatland very wet and soggy, and if this water is never released, if it never really dries out or drains anywhere, and more water just keeps getting added to the ecosystem through rain and additional flooding and whatever else, then the peatland can turn into a bog or a mire. These are generally treeless landscapes, like you would find in the tundra, near the tundra, or in a grassland, which have soil so saturated with water that there are ponds and lakes of standing water dotting the entire landscape from horizon to horizon. All of this standing water naturally feeds all manner of insects that breed and lay their eggs in the water, like mosquitoes. In the summer, if you travel inside the Arctic Circle in Canada or Alaska or Siberia, you'll be roaming across a landscape that's mostly barren, treeless tundra, with bogs and muskegs existing where the soils are waterlogged and acidic from all of the decaying boreal vegetation. Sphagnum mosses will cover everything, from the soil surface to the rocks to any lonely anomalous trees that happen to be growing that far north. So the reason the peat bogs form is because the peat soil is extremely absorptive of water. It absorbs water and holds water and spreads out the damp reach of the wetland environment. Water can saturate peat soil and end up creating lakes and ponds of standing water that feed all manner of insects. And the reason that the peat soil is so absorptive in the first place is because the sphagnum mosses have large structural cells in their leaves called hyaline cells. These little moss leaves use these cells for structural support, for mechanically filling out biomass, and they are amazingly effective at storing water. When sphagnum moss are growing in well-hydrated soil, they can absorb anywhere from 16 to 26 times their dry mass in water. This will make their leaves look swollen, and it makes their branches look like they were some kind of gummy snack, like a gummy bear that's shaped like a plant. The heavy internal turgor pressure just gives them this wet, plasticky, inflated look, like a water balloon. I mean, I suppose that's a pretty accurate description, because the moss's tissue is literally inflated with water, and the cell membranes and the cell walls are all expanding outwards to accommodate this water load, just like the balloon part of a water balloon. The sphagnum mosses retain this absorbency through life and into death, which is why the peat soil is so absorbent. The peat is made up of millions of dead little gametophyte shoots, and even though these are all dead and no longer growing, they still possess these hyaline cells that can still absorb and hold a huge amount of water. It's all structural. It's how the structure of the plant interacts with the physical world around it. Alright, so before I talk about moss too long and run out of time, I'm going to move on to the hornworts, which, among all of the bryophytes that I've talked about today, are the most closely related to the vascular land plants. The hornworts are the most closely related bryophyte to everything else that you typically consider to be a plant, whether it's a pine tree or an orange tree, a blueberry bush or a tomato plant, a garden flower, a cactus, a fern. All of these things are connected evolutionarily to the bryophytes through the hornworts. Okay, so what are these things? Well, just like mosses and liverworts, the hornworts are non-vascular. They undergo an alternation of generations, with the gametophyte generation being the dominant, longer-lived one, and the small, short-lived sporophyte generation grows out of the gametophyte's body. And they require water as a medium to facilitate their reproduction. So those are the similarities. But unlike mosses and liverworts, the hornworts have just a single chloroplast in each of their cells. Where most plants typically have lots and lots of chloroplasts in each cell, all of them busy away conducting photosynthesis and producing the energy to produce sugar, the single chloroplast of the hornwort cell is integrated into a larger, more diverse chemical complex. This part chloroplast superstructure produces and stores all of the food that the cell needs. In plants, this arrangement is very uncommon and arguably inefficient, but it's common in numerous algae species, which are frequently composed of populations of single cells. The alternation of generations in a hornwort works much like it does in the liverworts and the mosses. A spore will land somewhere and germinate, with a single cell extending a tube-like projection that begins to divide at its tip. This leads to the development of the mature gametophyte, which has really varied morphology depending on the species in question. The mature gametophyte can look like a continuous, lumpy green carpet with thick, leaf or lobe-like projections. They can look like tiny weeds or small shrubs, and others can look like weird lettuce without any veins in the leaves. From within their gametophyte body, whatever form it happens to take, the mature hornworts can grow their sex organs and produce gametes. Just like liverworts and mosses, the hornworts have female archegonia and male antheridia, and various species can be either monoecious or dioecious. The archegonia and the antheridia are grown inside little cavities or pores in the surface of the gametophyte, which are only exposed to open air when the cells in the tissue above them die off and fall away. Upon fertilization, the zygote develops into the sporophyte, which erupts out of the gametophyte to grow into an upward-reaching stalk. At the tip of this stalk is the bulbous capsule, which produces, stores, and then releases the sporophyte spores. While the bryophytes might not have the most valuable or noticeable roles in the local ecology, they have had several important functions and roles to play in Earth's natural history. For example, it's believed that early moss spreading across the ground 470 million years ago was responsible for extracting a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. These huge fields of mosses absorbed CO2 as they were growing and generating biomass, and they chemically dissolved the upper layers of the rocks that they were growing on. This organic chemical weathering of the rocks did a couple interesting things. First, by chemically altering the rocks, this allowed the rocks to reabsorb carbon dioxide to produce more carbonate, and this pulled more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And second, the process released mineral dust, rich with calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and iron, and a lot of this mineral-rich dust got into the oceans. Because iron is a very limited resource in the oceans, seeding iron into the ocean will feed algae, creating an algae bloom. The algae bloom involves the sudden and explosive growth of algae, which consumes more CO2 to produce the biomass, and directs that carbon towards biological sinks. This moss-fed process of altering rocks, producing sediment, and generating algae blooms is all very carbon-intensive, and it extracts a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's believed that through all of these processes, enough carbon dioxide was extracted from the atmosphere over millions of years that the global temperature lowered, and the world began going through a series of ice ages. Because early mammals were heavily shaped over millions of years by the evolutionary pressures of a cooling climate, it's worth appreciating the subtle influence that moss has had on our own evolution. Well, I think that that's about it for today's episode on the Bryophytes. I always find it fascinating how you can look at even the smallest, most seemingly mundane things, like some moss growing on a tree, and know that it's this amazingly complex multicellular structure with unique enzymes and chemical responses and ecological functions. Looking at the ecological effects of these small organisms is also really fascinating, because, maybe this is just me thinking this, but I find it mind-blowing and surreal how such tiny things can have such a large, profound, collective influence. This should also be a good example for you to understand that because all life is interdependent on all other life, even these small, seemingly innocuous plants have a role to play, that they serve some tiny but crucial purpose in a particular habitat, whether it be to supplement the diet of rodents, provide feeding opportunities for insect larvae, or by dying to accumulate water-absorptive peat that can then eventually transform the entire habitat into a wetland. This interesting dynamic between tiny organism and its capacity to reshape an entire habitat is one of the fun things about life that makes biology so interesting. If you like this episode, then hit the like button. And if you like all of this content, if you like everything I've been producing lately, then hit the subscribe button so you can see all my new episodes right when I post them. If you're listening to this on iTunes, then be sure to go and give the podcast a review. All of your good ratings and your comments and reviews really help to keep the podcast up in the science listings so more people can find it, and more people can learn about the wonders of biology. If you're enjoying this series so far, then stick around for the next episode, which will explore the next two major lineages that emerged in the plant kingdom after the evolution of vascular tissue. The first was the Lycophytes, and the second was the ferns. So if that sounds interesting to you, then be sure to stick around and check it out. And as always, thanks for listening.